Welcome back to the Sleepy Mind channel. Tonight we will spend some time with you, Scorpio. We will move through your qualities in the same steady way that patterns move through the night sky. This movement is slow, predictable, and free from effort. If you find these zodiac sleep stories useful, you are welcome to like the video and subscribe for more. You can also explore our other videos, each created to help you fall asleep in a calm and unhurried way. If you choose to leave a comment about where you are listening from, it is always interesting to see how far these stories travel. Many listeners find it grounding to notice this quiet sense of connection. Now, we begin with you, Scorpio. This time is simply for you. People often assume they understand you once they've noticed the obvious parts. The quiet, the intensity, the way you don't rush to fill space. They take note of those things and then stop looking, as if the rest of you will reveal itself later, without much effort. It usually doesn't work like that. Most of what matters about you happens somewhere underneath the surface layer of things, in places that don't announce themselves. You listen to what's being said, of course, but your attention doesn't stay there for very long. It drifts slightly lower, toward tone, timing, and the small gaps between words that tend to carry more information than the words themselves. You're not doing this on purpose, it's just how your attention settles. Depth isn't something you seek out as a concept. You don't wake up looking for intensity or meaning. It's simply where things end up once you've stayed with them long enough. Conversations thicken. Situations slow down. Even fairly ordinary moments can take on weight if you don't rush past them too quickly. From the outside, this can look like stillness. From the inside, there's a steady sense of things arranging themselves. You don't experience neutrality very often. Something either has your attention or it doesn't. When it does, your focus settles in completely, without much drama. Other things don't compete. They just move out of the way, as if they were never meant to be in the foreground at the same time. Halfway engagement feels awkward to you, like holding a door open without knowing whether you're meant to go through it or let it close. Intensity, for you, isn't loud. It doesn't spike or spill. It sits. You can feel a great deal without needing to express much of it, and that isn't suppression. It's more like storage. Things stay inside until they've finished becoming whatever they're going to be. This is often where people misread you. Quiet gets mistaken for distance. Restraint gets mistaken for indifference. Stillness gets mistaken for a lack of feeling altogether. What's missed is how much is actually being taken in during all that apparent calm. You tend to pay more attention to patterns than to moments. One interaction doesn't tell you much on its own. What matters is how things repeat, how someone behaves when nothing is at stake, how they behave when something tightens slightly, whether what they say continues to line up with what happens next. Those details don't feel small to you. They feel structural. Appearances rarely do much work on you. Charm can be pleasant. Emotion can be expressive. Neither of them carry much weight unless they're supported by something more consistent underneath. You're interested in what holds when nothing is being managed. Clarity has a settling effect on you, even when it's uncomfortable. Vague reassurance does the opposite. Comfort that avoids truth feels thin, like standing on something that might give way if you lean too hard. You'd rather know where you are than be kept at ease without any real footing. You don't open yourself quickly, not because vulnerability feels dangerous, but because it feels valuable. What you share carries weight, and you want the moment to be able to hold it. Offering something unfinished feels careless, like handing someone a sentence you haven't finished thinking yet. When you do speak, It's usually complete. Not perfectly phrased, not polished, but whole. Whatever needed time to settle has already done that by the time it leaves you. Trust doesn't arrive for you as a feeling. It arrives as a conclusion, formed slowly through repetition, through reliability, through moments where care could have been casual and wasn't. Once it's there, it changes the way you move. Loyalty becomes practical and steady rather than emotional or loud. You stay present. You protect what matters without making a point of it. When trust erodes, it doesn't collapse all at once. It thins. A detail stops lining up. Something feels slightly off. You notice, you store the information, and you keep watching. Eventually, the internal conclusion forms, quietly, without any urge to announce itself. By the time anything shifts on the surface, it's already finished inside. Endings tend to work that way for you. They happen internally first. From the outside, they can look sudden or confusing. From your perspective, they feel overdue, like something that finally caught up to where you already were. You don't hover once that shift has happened. Energy withdraws and redirects without ceremony. Not as punishment, not as a statement, just as a correction. Depth doesn't overwhelm you. If anything, it steadies you. In situations other people find heavy, you often become clearer rather than reactive. Pressure has a way of organizing your thoughts instead of scattering them. What drains you isn't difficulty, it's falseness. Mixed signals irritate. Urgency without sincerity makes you slow down rather than speed up. Pressure disguised as care is easy for you to spot, even when it's subtle. You tend to trust what feels steady more than what feels loud. Solitude doesn't unsettle you either. It gives your inner world room to arrange itself without interruption. Silence doesn't need to be empty to be useful. It just needs to be honest. You don't rely much on external validation to know where you stand. Internal alignment does that job well enough. And this is how you tend to move through life. Not by reacting to what shows up on the surface, but by staying with what reveals itself slowly enough to be real, even if no one else is paying much attention to the process. Attention, for you, has a different texture than it does for most people. It doesn't flicker or scan. It settles. Once it's there, it stays put until something gives it a reason to move. This is why divided focus feels uncomfortable. Not impossible, just wrong. Like trying to listen closely to one conversation while someone else keeps clearing their throat nearby. Nothing quite lands the way it should. Something always feels unfinished. When something has your attention, it has all of it. Other concerns don't compete. They recede quietly, as if they understand they'll get their turn later, or not at all. You don't juggle well when things matter. You don't want to. Time behaves differently in those moments. Hours pass without much notice, not because you're avoiding anything, but because you're present enough that clock watching stops being relevant. From the outside, it can look intense. From the inside, it feels economical, even restful in its own way. People sometimes mistake this kind of focus for rigidity. What they don't see is how much flexibility happened earlier. Possibilities were tested privately, alternatives considered and discarded. By the time you settle into something, the wandering has already done its work. This is why your decisions can feel abrupt to other people. They weren't there for the internal movement. They only see the moment where things finally become visible. The same pattern shows up in how you relate to people. You don't spread yourself thin easily. You invest where there's depth, consistency, and a sense that the connection can carry weight over time. Partial involvement feels awkward, like starting a sentence and never finishing it. When your attention is pulled in too many directions by other people's needs, something in you tightens. Not resentment exactly, more like strain, a sense that your focus is being diluted into something less accurate. That's usually when you begin to withdraw quietly, not to make a point, but to restore coherence. You don't enjoy being rushed to move on from something you're still processing. Once a thread has begun, you want to follow it until it naturally ends. Premature closure feels like leaving a door half open, knowing there's still something inside you haven't looked at properly yet. This is also why superficial change rarely satisfies you. Cosmetic fixes don't alter the underlying structure. Apologies that don't shift behavior register as noise. Temporary enthusiasm fades quickly if it isn't anchored to something real. You can tell when something has genuinely changed because your body responds before your thoughts catch up. The tension you are holding releases. Your attention loosens. The thread either resolves or disappears entirely. Until that happens, you stay. Pressure doesn't rattle you in the way people expect. If anything, it simplifies things. When situations get serious, your mind organizes itself quickly. What matters becomes obvious. What doesn't falls away without much debate. What drains you isn't difficulty. It's clutter pretending to be importance. Emotional volume used as a substitute for truth. Urgency that isn't attached to anything solid. Around those things, you slow down and wait. Not because you're avoiding them, but because you're listening for what's actually there. And you're willing to wait longer than most. Control, in this sense, has very little to do with steering other people. It's about orientation, knowing where you're standing. Once that's clear, everything else becomes negotiable. Clear situations, even uncomfortable ones, allow your system to relax. Murky situations keep part of you alert, as if you're listening for something that hasn't been said yet. You don't rush to fill that silence. People reveal themselves there, in what they avoid, in what they repeat, in what only shows up when things tighten slightly. You don't need to interrogate. Patterns do the talking. Reassurance rarely works on you for long. It smooths the surface, but leaves the structure untouched. Truth, even when it's inconvenient, has edges you can lean against. Once those edges are clear, something inside you clicks into place. Not relief exactly, orientation. From there, control stops being necessary. You're no longer guessing. Decisions that come from that place don't need defending. They don't need consensus. Agreement can be pleasant, but accuracy matters more. This can make you seem inflexible to people who equate responsiveness with speed. What they miss is how much movement already happened before you arrived where you are. By the time you stop, you've already been everywhere else. There's a certain patience built into the way you wait for things to show themselves. Not passive patience, not the kind that sits on its hands, but the kind that stays alert without interfering. You don't poke at situations to see what happens. You let them unfold, knowing that whatever is real will surface on its own if given enough space. This is one of the reasons people can feel strangely exposed around you. You're not asking probing questions or demanding honesty. You're simply present in a way that doesn't rush them past themselves. Silence stretches a little longer. Explanations slow down. People often end up saying more than they planned, not because you pulled it out of them, but because nothing interrupted the moment where it was about to come out anyway. You notice how people handle that space, whether they rush to fill it, whether they sit with it, whether they use it to clarify something or to hide behind something smoother. These details tell you far more than direct answers ever could. You don't tend to announce what you're learning from this. You don't need to. The information settles quietly and adjusts how you engage next. Access shifts. Attention narrows or widens. Energy gets redistributed without a conversation needing to happen. This can make your changes feel abrupt to others. One day you're fully there. The next, you're not. What they don't see is how long the decision took to form, or how carefully you watched before it arrived. You're not interested in collecting information for its own sake. You're interested in knowing where something actually stands. Once you know that, curiosity relaxes. There's nothing left to investigate. You tend to trust consistency more than intention. People can intend many things. Consistency requires follow-through. It survives mood, stress, distraction. When something remains steady across those conditions, it earns your respect. Loyalty grows out of that steadiness, not as an emotional surge, but as a quiet commitment to stay present. You don't dramatize it. You simply keep showing up until there's a reason not to. When that reason appears, you don't bargain with it. You don't argue yourself out of what you already know. The shift happens internally, and once it does, there's no real urge to revisit it. What's finished feels finished. You rarely look back after that point. Not out of bitterness, but out of accuracy. Returning would mean pretending the thread is still active when it isn't. This way of moving can look severe to people who process things out loud. To you, it feels clean. Lingering after clarity feels like clutter. You also tend to be more comfortable than most with things that don't resolve neatly. Uncertainty doesn't automatically make you anxious. In some cases, it actually feels preferable to false certainty. At least uncertainty is honest about what it is. What unsettles you is ambiguity that's being maintained deliberately. When clarity could exist but doesn't, when things stay vague to avoid responsibility or discomfort, that's when your patience thins. You don't always challenge this directly. Sometimes you do. Often you don't. More commonly, you adjust your position and let the situation reveal how much substance it actually has without your participation. There's a quiet confidence in that approach. Not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that trusts its own timing. You don't need to prove you're right. You just need to stay aligned with what you know. You've probably noticed that you're less interested in being understood immediately than in being understood accurately. If that takes time, so be it. If it never happens, that's tolerable too. What matters is that you're not distorting yourself to speed things along. And so you keep moving through situations with that same contained attentiveness, letting depth do its work, without rushing it, trusting that what's real will remain once everything else has fallen away. There's also a particular way you relate to effort. You don't mind working hard, but you mind working vaguely. Energy spent without direction feels heavier than effort spent on something difficult, but clear. This is why you're not easily impressed by enthusiasm on its own. Excitement can be genuine and still lead nowhere. You watch to see what happens after the initial surge fades. What remains, once things get ordinary again, tends to matter more to you than how they began. You're often at your most comfortable when things are slightly serious, not heavy, not grim, just grounded enough that words have consequences and actions mean something. Lightness is fine, but it has to be honest. Forced positivity makes you suspicious in a way you don't always articulate. You've probably noticed that you don't need many people close to you. You need the right ones. Being known deeply by a few feels far more stabilizing than being known superficially by many. Depth replaces quantity without leaving a gap. When someone earns that closeness, you don't ration yourself. You're present, reliable, attentive in ways that don't draw attention to themselves. You remember what matters to people. You notice when something shifts. You show up consistently, not performatively. This steadiness can go unnoticed at first. It's quiet. It doesn't ask for recognition. Over time, though, it becomes unmistakable. People come to rely on it without quite realizing when that happened. You also notice when that reliance turns one-sided, not immediately. It's rarely dramatic. More like a slow realization that effort is no longer being met in kind, that attention is being taken for granted rather than returned. You don't react straight away. You wait to see whether the balance corrects itself. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. When it doesn't, you don't escalate. You don't demand. You adjust. Availability narrows. Initiative shifts. What was once freely offered becomes more selective. The change is quiet, but it's deliberate. This isn't punishment. It's maintenance. You're careful with how much you invest because you know how deeply you invest once you do. Wasting that depth on something hollow feels careless. You'd rather hold it back than scatter it. You've probably noticed that you don't enjoy explaining this part of yourself. Explaining feels like overexposure. The people who understand tend to do so without needing a breakdown. You're also not particularly interested in fixing other people. Understanding them is usually enough. Once you see how someone operates, you know how to respond. Change is their work, not yours. This makes you less reactive than people expect in emotional situations. You don't rush to soothe. You don't rush to solve. You stay present and see what emerges when things aren't immediately managed away. Sometimes what emerges is honesty. Sometimes it's avoidance. Either way, the information is useful. You're not uncomfortable with intensity in others as long as it's real. What unsettles you is intensity used to distract, overwhelm, or bypass responsibility. Around that, you become very still. Stillness, for you, is often a sign that you're paying closer attention, not less. You've probably noticed that you trust your own internal signals more than advice. Not because advice is worthless, but because alignment is physical for you. When something is off, your body registers it before your mind has words for it. When something fits, the tension you didn't realize you were holding releases. That release is subtle, no fireworks, just a sense that you can breathe normally again. You don't need that feeling to be validated by anyone else. It's enough that you feel it. And so you continue, choosing carefully where to place your depth, staying with what proves itself over time, and stepping back from what doesn't, without needing to make a scene out of either choice. Sometimes the realization arrives slowly enough that you don't recognize it as a decision at first. Nothing dramatic shifts. There's no moment where you sit back and think, this is it. Instead, interest thins gradually, attention loosens, and you find yourself no longer checking the same details you were tracking before. The absence registers later, when you notice how much quieter things have become internally. Before that point, there's a lot of quiet monitoring going on. Not anxious, not obsessive, just present. You notice what happens when you stop compensating, when you don't smooth the moment, when you leave a question unanswered a little longer than usual. These small gaps tend to reveal more than direct pressure ever could. From the outside, nothing obvious has changed. You're still there, still listening, still engaged in the same way. What shifts is internal, and it stays internal until it finishes doing what it needs to do. That's why people can feel surprised later. They remember the version of you that was leaning forward. They didn't notice the point where your attention stopped doing that. There's a particular ease that comes with recognizing this shift, even if you don't label it as ease. The internal commentary quiets. You're no longer trying to work out what something might become. It has already shown you enough. Until that happens, you're patient with uncertainty in a way that can look passive, but isn't. You're waiting for something solid rather than something convenient. That waiting doesn't feel empty to you. It feels like listening with your whole body. You notice what repeats without changing, what adapts when pressure is applied, what keeps needing explanation to stay upright. Over time, those details line up on their own. You don't force them into meaning. You let them arrange themselves. When they do, the decision feels obvious rather than dramatic. That obviousness has a particular texture to it, one you felt often enough to trust. Once it's there, pretending otherwise feels unnecessary. You adjust, sometimes in small ways, sometimes completely, but always without the need to justify the movement. And from there, you keep going, not carrying the need to explain the shift, not revisiting the earlier uncertainty, simply staying with what now feels accurate enough to stand on without effort. You also tend to notice how differently people relate to pressure once it's no longer theoretical. When something is hypothetical, almost everyone sounds reasonable. When something actually matters, the shape of it changes. Voices tighten or soften. Attention sharpens or scatters. You watch what happens then, without commenting on it, because that's usually where the real information lives. Pressure doesn't make you rush. If anything, it slows you down just enough to see more clearly. You become less interested in possibilities and more interested in what's actually happening in front of you. What's being sustained? What's being avoided? What's being held together by habit rather than intention? This is why emotional urgency doesn't automatically move you. Someone else's need for immediate resolution can feel disconnected from the reality you're observing. You're not ignoring it. You're checking whether it aligns with what's actually unfolding, or whether it's trying to skip a few steps that still matter. You've probably noticed that you're not especially drawn to reassurance when things feel uncertain. Reassurance smooths the surface, but doesn't always change the structure underneath. You'd rather sit with the uncertainty a little longer and let it clarify itself, than accept comfort that doesn't actually resolve anything. This can make you appear unreactive in moments where others expect a strong response. They may fill the space with explanations or emotion, while you stay quiet, tracking what's consistent and what's shifting. From the outside, it can look like distance. From the inside, it's attention. You also have a way of sensing when effort is being used to compensate for something that isn't working. Extra enthusiasm, over-communication, repeated reassurance. None of these are bad on their own, but when they become necessary just to keep something afloat, you start to notice. You don't confront that immediately. You let it play out a little longer. You watch to see whether the structure corrects itself or whether the compensation increases. One of those tells you a lot more than the other. Over time, this shapes how you trust. Not as a feeling that appears suddenly, but as a quiet confidence that grows when behavior stays aligned without needing constant attention. When that alignment holds, you relax into it. When it doesn't, you don't force yourself to stay. This doesn't feel harsh to you. It feels precise. Staying engaged with something that requires ongoing distortion would mean losing track of yourself, and that's something you're rarely willing to do. You may have noticed that you're more comfortable than most, letting situations reveal their limits. You don't push past them. You don't try to negotiate with them endlessly. Once a limit shows itself clearly enough, you adjust your expectations and move accordingly. This is another way you conserve energy without making a point of it. You're not withdrawing out of frustration. You're reallocating attention based on what's actually possible. There's a certain steadiness that comes from trusting this process. You don't need to predict outcomes far in advance. You don't need guarantees. You just need to stay attentive long enough for things to show their shape. And when they do, you respond in ways that feel almost inevitable, not because you're inflexible, but because you've already done the work of noticing what holds and what doesn't. You continue like this, letting pressure clarify rather than rush you, allowing time to do some of the sorting for you, and staying oriented by what remains consistent when everything else is stripped back. You also have a way of separating signal from noise that doesn't rely on rules or principles. It's more tactile than that. Something either carries its own weight or it doesn't. You can feel when a situation is being propped up by effort rather than supported by something solid underneath. This is why you're rarely impressed by momentum alone. Things can move quickly and still go nowhere. Speed without direction feels hollow to you, like running in place while everyone congratulates themselves for moving. You slow down around that, not to resist it, but to see what's actually doing the work. You tend to notice when responsibility is being quietly passed around without anyone really holding it. When decisions stay vague, when accountability dissolves into good intentions. These patterns don't anger you straight away. They register, settle, and begin to shape how much of yourself you're willing to bring into the space. You're also aware that you don't need everything spelled out to understand it. In fact, over-explanation often makes you suspicious. When something is real, it usually doesn't require much reinforcement. It just keeps behaving the same way, even when no one is watching. Because of this, you don't feel the need to interrogate people to know where they stand. You watch how they handle ordinary moments, how they respond when nothing dramatic is happening. Those moments tend to tell you far more than crisis ever could. You've probably noticed that you don't enjoy being rushed into emotional clarity. Being told how you should feel by now, or what something must mean, makes you pull back rather than lean in. Understanding, for you, arrives when it's ready, not when it's demanded. This doesn't mean you avoid feeling. It means you don't like shortcuts. Emotional conclusions reached too quickly often collapse later, and you've learned to trust the slower route, even when it's less convenient. You also tend to be careful with how much you reveal while something is still forming. Not because you're hiding, but because you don't want to distort what's happening by exposing it too early. Some things need privacy to become accurate. People sometimes interpret that as guardedness. You experience it as patience. There's a quiet humor in the way you watch these misunderstandings play out. Not mockery, just recognition. You've seen how often depth gets mistaken for distance, how often restraint gets read as coldness. You don't rush to correct the impression. If it matters, it will correct itself. You're comfortable letting that happen. You've also noticed that once you stop doing some of the invisible work, situations tend to reveal their true balance very quickly. What holds continues to hold. What relied on your effort begins to wobble. That information saves you from having to make anything dramatic. This is one of the ways you protect your energy without drawing lines in the sand. You simply stop compensating. The adjustment happens on its own. You don't experience this as withdrawal so much as recalibration. Attention moves to where it's met. Depth goes where it's earned. Nothing has to be explained for that to make sense to you. And you keep moving in this way, not forcing clarity, not resisting it either, staying close enough to watch what endures, and far enough back to let it show itself without interference. You've probably noticed that once something proves it can stand on its own, you relax into it almost without realizing you've done so. There's less checking, less internal adjustment, fewer small corrections happening in the background. Your attention doesn't disappear, it just stops hovering. It's a subtle shift, but it changes how things feel inside you. Before that point, there's usually a quiet vigilance at work. Not anxiety, not suspicion, just awareness. You're noticing how things respond when you stop guiding them slightly. What happens when you don't offer reassurance first? How people behave when you're not smoothing the edges. Those moments tell you far more than direct questions ever could. You don't experience this as testing people. It feels more like letting gravity do its job. Whatever is solid settles. Whatever isn't starts to show strain. You don't rush to interpret it. You just take note. This is why you don't mind waiting while others grow uncomfortable. Discomfort doesn't scare you. What matters is whether it leads somewhere honest or just gets managed away. When it leads somewhere real, you stay with it. When it turns into avoidance, your interest fades naturally. You're also aware that this way of moving through things isn't always easy for others to understand. They want cues, feedback, signals that tell them where they stand. You tend to give those signals through consistency rather than commentary, which means they're easy to miss if someone isn't paying attention. You notice who does pay attention. Those are usually the people you end up trusting without much effort. Not because they demand access, but because they don't rush it. They let things take the time they need. Around them, you don't feel the same need to monitor or manage. Something settles on its own. When that happens, your depth feels lighter, not because it's diminished, but because it's no longer bracing against uncertainty. The internal pressure that was holding everything in place eases, and what remains feels stable rather than tense. You don't announce this shift when it happens. There's no reason to. From the outside, nothing looks dramatically different. From the inside, you're no longer working as hard to stay oriented. This is one of the ways rest shows up for you, though you might not think of it that way. Not as stopping, not as switching off, but as no longer needing to hold everything together. The structure is sound enough to stand without constant attention. You've learned to trust that feeling because it's been reliable. When it's there, you know you don't need to keep circling the same questions. When it isn't, you know there's still something worth noticing. So you continue in this measured way, letting things reveal themselves at their own pace, staying engaged without forcing movement, and allowing clarity to arrive when it's ready, rather than when it's convenient. You've likely noticed that this steadiness changes how you experience connection as well. When something is still unproven, you stay attentive but reserved. Once it proves itself, your presence becomes easier, less guarded, almost casual in a way that surprises people who expected intensity to stay switched on all the time. That ease isn't indifference, it's efficiency. You're no longer spending energy tracking variables that have already settled. What remains is simply engagement, without the background work that was happening before. You don't confuse this with comfort exactly. Comfort can be misleading. What you're responding to is reliability. Things doing what they say they'll do. People showing up the same way more than once. Situations holding their shape without constant reinforcement. When that reliability is missing, you feel it quickly. Not as alarm, but as friction. Something begins to require more effort than it should. You find yourself compensating again, smoothing things, holding pieces in place that don't want to stay there on their own. That's usually when your attention starts to loosen. You don't experience this as disappointment so much as information. The system is telling you how much it can handle. Pushing past that point wouldn't deepen anything. It would just distort it. You're also aware that you don't need to be fully understood to stay engaged. You need to be met accurately. There's a difference. Being understood often invites interpretation. Being met accurately simply means the other person isn't asking you to be different from what you are. You notice when someone listens without translating, when they don't rush to categorize or soften what you're saying, when they let the shape of it remain intact. Around those people, you don't feel the same need to hold back. This doesn't happen often, which is why you don't look for it everywhere. You recognize it when it appears, and you adjust accordingly. You also tend to notice how people handle your boundaries once they appear. Some try to negotiate them immediately. Some ignore them. Some accept them without comment. The last group usually stands out to you in ways you don't need to explain. You don't experience boundaries as walls. They feel more like lines that keep things in proportion. When those lines are respected, everything inside them feels more workable. There's also a quiet satisfaction in knowing you don't need to monitor everything all the time. You can let some things run without supervision. You can step back without worrying they'll fall apart. That trust doesn't come easily, but when it's there, it changes how you breathe in a room. You don't cling to that feeling. You don't try to preserve it by force. You let it be temporary if it needs to be. Forcing continuity would defeat the point. This is another reason you're rarely nostalgic. You remember what mattered, but you don't try to recreate it. What held once will either hold again or it won't. You're more interested in what's actually happening now than in what used to work. When something ends, you don't rush to fill the space it leaves. You let the space exist long enough to see what wants to take its place. Sometimes nothing does for a while, and that doesn't bother you as much as people expect. You're comfortable with that pause. It gives your attention room to reset, to redistribute, to settle somewhere new without being pulled by habit. Eventually, something earns its way back into focus, not through urgency, but through consistency, and you move toward it in the same way you always do. Slowly at first, attentive, letting it show you whether it can stand on its own before you decide how much of yourself it deserves. There's also the way you relate to commitment that doesn't quite fit the usual descriptions. You don't resist it, and you don't chase it either. You let it arrive once the shape of something is clear enough to hold without constant effort. Until then, you stay close but unclaimed, present without being bound. This can feel confusing to people who equate commitment with immediacy. They look for declarations, timelines, visible signs. You're paying attention to something else entirely. Whether the connection keeps its integrity when nothing is being promised. Whether interest remains steady when novelty wears off. whether presence continues when no one is trying particularly hard. Once those things are evident, commitment stops feeling like a risk. It feels like a recognition. You don't tend to romanticize the act of choosing. You're more interested in what happens after the choice is made. Does it simplify things? Does it reduce noise? Does it make the next steps more obvious rather than more complicated? When it does, you settle into it easily. When it doesn't, you start to notice the strain. You're also aware that you don't need to control outcomes to feel safe. What you need is a sense that whatever unfolds will do so honestly. Surprises don't bother you as much as distortions do. You can adapt to change. You don't adapt well to things that pretend to be something they're not. This is why you're comfortable sitting with tension longer than most. Not the tension that comes from conflict, but the tension that comes from things not being fully defined yet. You don't rush to resolve it. You let it clarify itself, knowing that premature resolution often just moves the problem somewhere else. You've probably noticed that you don't mind being the one who waits while others push forward. Waiting doesn't feel like inaction to you. It feels like listening without interrupting. You're also aware that once you stop listening, there's no real reason to stay. Engagement without attention feels hollow. You don't pretend otherwise. This gives your presence a certain weight. When you're there, you're actually there. When you're not, it's because something else has earned your focus. There's nothing performative about either state. People sometimes read this as intensity, or mystery, or reserve. You experience it as economy. You don't spend yourself where it won't land. You've learned that depth doesn't need to be dramatic to be meaningful. In fact, the most durable connections you've had often grew quietly, without spectacle. They were built through repetition, reliability, and moments that didn't announce themselves as important at the time. That's why you're not drawn to grand gestures as proof of anything. You notice what happens in the ordinary spaces instead. How someone treats what doesn't demand attention. How they handle what no one is watching. Those details tell you what will last. And so you continue, letting commitment emerge from consistency rather than urgency, staying responsive without rushing, and trusting that what's meant to stay will show itself clearly enough without needing to be forced. You've also noticed that when things are truly aligned, they require very little commentary. Conversations don't need constant clarification. Expectations don't need to be restated. The structure holds without being propped up, and that absence of effort feels noticeable to you in a way that's hard to explain to anyone who isn't sensitive to it. Before that point, there's usually a background hum of adjustment, small course corrections, subtle recalibrations. You're paying attention to how much energy it takes to keep something workable, not because you're counting, but because the difference between ease and strain registers immediately. When the strain outweighs the return, you don't dramatize the realization. You simply stop investing extra effort. You let the situation show you what remains once you're no longer compensating for it. That moment tends to be clarifying all on its own. You don't see this as testing people. It feels closer to letting reality speak without interference. Whatever is solid stays. Whatever was being held together by your attention alone starts to loosen. That information is enough. You're also aware that this way of moving doesn't reward performance. People who rely on intensity, urgency, or constant reassurance often feel unsettled around you. You're not mirroring their energy back to them. You're watching to see what's underneath it. What you're listening for isn't excitement or certainty, it's coherence. Does the story stay the same over time? Does the behavior match the explanation? Does the connection keep its shape when nothing is being emphasized? You notice when it does. When it does, something in you softens without becoming loose. Your attention becomes easier, less guarded, not because you've lowered your standards, but because there's less to guard against. You don't mistake this for trust arriving suddenly. It's simply the moment when vigilance is no longer required. The system has shown itself capable of holding weight without constant monitoring. You tend to recognize this moment quickly, even if you don't talk about it. There's a physical sense of settling. Breathing deepens. Thoughts stop circling the same questions. What remains feels workable. You also recognize when that moment never arrives. In those cases, you don't force resolution. You don't push for answers that haven't earned their clarity yet. You let the lack of settling be the answer. That absence tells you as much as presence ever could. You've learned to trust that distinction. It's saved you time, energy, and unnecessary explanation more than once. Because of this, you're rarely tempted to overcommit early. You let things earn their depth. You let relationships, ideas, and situations demonstrate their capacity before you invest fully. That patience isn't hesitation, it's discernment. You're comfortable standing in that space where things are still becoming, not rushing them forward, not pulling away either, just watching how they behave when left alone long enough to be honest. And you keep moving in this way, attentive without pressing, responsive without chasing, letting alignment reveal itself through consistency rather than declaration, and trusting that what's real will continue to hold once the noise has dropped away. You've probably noticed that this way of paying attention also shapes how you deal with conflict, though you might not think of it as conflict at all. Disagreement doesn't automatically register as a problem. It's just another piece of information about how something is structured. What matters to you is not whether tension exists, but whether it can be held without distortion. Some tensions sharpen understanding, others collapse into noise. You can feel the difference fairly quickly, and you respond accordingly. You don't rush to smooth things over just to restore surface calm. Calm without honesty feels brittle. You're more interested in whether the underlying issue has room to breathe, even if that means letting things stay uncomfortable a little longer than most people would like. This can make you seem unyielding in moments where others are eager to resolve. From your perspective, resolution that skips over something real isn't resolution at all. It's postponement. You've likely noticed that when someone engages you honestly in these moments, you soften, not because the disagreement disappears, but because the structure can now hold it. When honesty is present, tension stops feeling threatening. When it isn't, you don't escalate. You go quiet, not as withdrawal, but as attention narrowing. You stop offering unnecessary energy. You let the imbalance show itself. You're also aware that you don't need to win arguments to feel secure. Winning doesn't interest you much. Accuracy does. You'd rather be clear than be right, and you're willing to sit with ambiguity if it means staying aligned with what you actually know. This is another reason you don't argue for long. Once the useful information has surfaced, continuing feels redundant. The conversation has done its work. You may have noticed that people sometimes try to pull you back into debates after you've already moved on. They're still processing. You're already done. From their side, it can feel abrupt. From yours, it's simply efficient. This efficiency isn't coldness, it's conservation. You don't spend energy where nothing new is happening. You also don't assume that every difference needs to be reconciled. Some differences are simply indicators of incompatibility, not problems to be solved. You're comfortable letting that be the case without trying to fix it. There's a quiet respect in that. You're not asking people to be different so you can stay. You're noticing whether staying makes sense as things actually are. This same clarity shows up in how you handle mistakes, your own included. You don't tend to dwell on them emotionally, but you don't ignore them either. You look at what happened, note what it revealed, and adjust. The learning sticks because it's integrated, not because it was punished. You've probably noticed that this makes you resilient in a way that doesn't draw much attention. Setbacks don't derail you, they inform you. You recalibrate and keep going without needing to make a story out of it. And so you continue, moving through disagreements, adjustments, and shifts with the same steady attentiveness you bring to everything else, letting truth shape your responses more than urgency, and trusting that clarity will emerge when the structure is allowed to speak for itself. You've also noticed that this way of engaging leaves you with very little interest in dramatics, even when something significant is happening. Big moments don't feel like they need big reactions. What matters to you is whether the moment changes the structure of things, not how loudly it announces itself. You tend to notice when something important has happened because of what stops happening afterwards. The repeated checking falls away. The internal negotiation quiets. You no longer feel the need to keep an eye on the same details. The shift shows up as absence rather than spectacle. This is one of the reasons you rarely chase reassurance. Reassurance fills space. You're listening for what no longer needs to be filled. When something is stable, it doesn't ask for commentary. It just continues. You're also aware that this can make you seem emotionally economical in situations where others expect more display. You don't offer reaction as proof of care. You offer presence, consistency, and follow through. Those things don't always look impressive in the moment, but they hold over time. You've probably noticed that you're not drawn to explaining your inner process while it's still unfolding. Talking too early tends to flatten things that are still taking shape. You prefer to let understanding finish forming before you put words to it, if you put words to it at all. This can create gaps in communication that others misinterpret. They may assume distance or detachment where there is simply processing. You don't rush to correct that assumption. If clarity matters, it will arrive later in a more accurate form. You're also comfortable with the idea that not everything needs to be shared to be real. Some things remain internal without losing their validity. You don't equate privacy with avoidance. Privacy feels like accuracy to you. You may have noticed that this allows you to remain steady when situations shift unexpectedly. Sudden changes don't disorient you as much as gradual distortions do. You can adapt to new information quickly. What unsettles you is when information is withheld or obscured. This is why transparency matters to you, even if you don't demand it explicitly. You watch for it instead. You notice when explanations simplify too much, when language smooths over something that doesn't quite fit. Those moments stand out. You don't react to them immediately. You let them join the rest of what you're observing. Over time, they either resolve themselves or they don't. Both outcomes tell you something useful. Because of this, you don't feel the need to control situations tightly. Control, for you, comes from orientation rather than dominance. Once you understand where you are, you can respond appropriately without forcing anything to move faster than it should. You've probably noticed that this makes you less anxious about outcomes than people expect. You're more interested in process, how something unfolds, what it reveals as it unfolds. Outcomes make sense once the process has been understood. This doesn't mean you're indifferent to results. It means you don't fixate on them prematurely. Fixation tends to distort attention. You prefer to stay close to what's actually happening. And so you continue, attentive without being intrusive, steady without being rigid, allowing situations to clarify themselves through time and consistency rather than pressure, and trusting that what matters will remain visible once everything unnecessary has dropped away. You've probably also noticed that this way of moving through things gives you a fairly reliable sense of when to speak and when not to. You don't follow a rule for it. It's more like a feeling that settles in the body before it ever becomes a decision. Sometimes words feel useful. Other times they feel like they would only disturb what's already forming. When words are useful, you use them carefully, not sparingly exactly, but deliberately. You're not trying to win a moment or shape an outcome. You're trying to describe something accurately enough that it can be dealt with. Once that's done, there's no need to keep talking. This is why you don't repeat yourself often. Repetition only makes sense if something new is happening. When nothing is changing, saying it again feels pointless. You'd rather wait and see whether behavior shifts before deciding whether anything else needs to be said. You're also aware that silence can be uncomfortable for people who rely on constant feedback. You don't rush to relieve that discomfort. Not because you want to create it, but because filling it too quickly would erase information you're still watching. Silence, in that sense, becomes another way of listening. You've probably noticed how often clarity arrives after you stop trying to produce it. When you're no longer explaining, negotiating, or reframing, something settles on its own. The situation either holds together or it doesn't. Both outcomes tell you what you need to know. This can make your decisions feel delayed and then sudden. Others remember the action. You remember the long stretch of noticing that came before it. By the time you move, you're not weighing options anymore. You're responding to something that's already resolved internally. You don't feel much urge to justify that response. Justification would mean reopening something that's already finished. You trust the internal sense of completion enough to let it stand without extra support. You've likely noticed that this trust didn't appear overnight. It's something you built by watching yourself wait, move, and adjust again and again. You've seen what happens when you rush and when you don't. Over time, the difference became obvious. That history gives you a quiet confidence that doesn't depend on certainty. You don't need to be sure of everything in advance. You just need to stay attentive long enough for things to show you what they are. You also don't confuse this attentiveness with control. You're not steering events. You're letting them unfold while staying close enough to respond accurately. There's a difference, and you can feel it when you're doing one versus the other. This is why you don't feel compelled to manage people's reactions. Managing reactions tends to distort reality. You'd rather let reactions happen and then decide what they reveal. Sometimes they reveal compatibility. Sometimes they reveal limits. Either way, the information is useful. You're comfortable letting that usefulness guide your next step without turning it into a story about what should have happened. The story adds weight. The information lightens it. And so you keep moving in this way, letting silence do some of the work, letting time do some of the sorting, and trusting that attention, when left alone long enough, tends to organize itself around what actually matters. You may have noticed that this approach also changes how you experience anticipation. You don't spend much time imagining how things might turn out. Not because you lack imagination, but because speculation feels thin compared to what actually happens when something unfolds in front of you. You're more interested in watching the process than rehearsing the outcome. What people do once they think no one is watching. How situations behave when they're no longer being actively guided. Those moments tend to be more revealing than any plan or projection. This makes waiting feel different for you than it does for others. Waiting isn't a pause between actions. It's part of the action itself. You're not idle during that time. You're gathering texture, noticing shifts, sensing when something begins to settle or lose coherence. You've probably noticed that this gives you a fairly accurate sense of timing. Not clock time, but relational time. When a conversation has reached its limit, when a situation is ready to move, when it's better to let something end quietly rather than force it to continue. You don't always act immediately on that sense. Sometimes you wait just a little longer, not because you're uncertain, but because you're confirming what you already feel. When the confirmation arrives, it doesn't surprise you. You're also aware that this way of moving doesn't produce many dramatic stories. There are no big turning points or decisive speeches. Things change gradually, and then suddenly they're different. People notice after the fact and try to locate the moment it happened. You rarely bother pointing it out. What matters to you is not the narrative, but the accuracy of the shift. Once something has changed internally, continuing to behave as if it hasn't feels dishonest. You adjust your behavior to match what you know, even if that adjustment is quiet enough to go unnoticed. This is another reason you're not drawn to performance, even in emotional contexts. Performance requires exaggeration. You prefer precision, saying exactly as much as is needed, and no more. You've probably noticed that you're comfortable letting conversations end without resolution. Not every thread needs to be tied off neatly. Some things resolve by no longer asking for attention. When that happens, continuing to talk about them feels unnecessary. You're also not especially tempted to revisit old decisions. Once something has been integrated, it stops pulling at you. You carry what you learned and let the rest fade. Nostalgia doesn't have much leverage with you unless it offers new information. This makes you appear decisive in hindsight, even if the process took time. Others remember the moment of action. You remember the long stretch of observation that made the action obvious. You've likely noticed that you don't feel much regret when you trust this process. Regret tends to show up when you move too quickly or ignore what you already know. When you stay attentive, outcomes tend to feel clean, even if they're difficult. This isn't about getting everything right. It's about staying aligned with what's actually happening rather than what you hoped might happen. And so you continue, allowing time to do some of the work, letting attention settle where it naturally wants to go, and trusting that clarity, when it arrives, will do so quietly and without needing to be announced. You've also noticed that this way of living leaves very little room for impulse, not because you suppress it, but because impulse doesn't tend to survive your attention for very long. If something is real, it holds. If it isn't, it fades once you stay with it, past the first surge. This is why quick decisions rarely appeal to you. Not because you can't make them, but because speed often skips over information you're still collecting. You prefer to let things reveal their full outline before responding, even if that means sitting with a little discomfort longer than most people would. You've probably noticed that this makes you less reactive in moments where others feel pulled to respond immediately. You're not resisting the moment. You're absorbing it. There's a difference, and you feel it clearly. Absorption gives you options. Reaction closes them. You also tend to notice when your own energy shifts before you can explain why. Something that once felt compelling no longer does. Something that felt heavy suddenly doesn't. These changes aren't dramatic. They register quietly, like a background hum dropping out. When that happens, you don't try to talk yourself back into the old feeling. You trust the shift. You've learned that arguing with your own attention rarely produces anything useful. This trust doesn't make you careless. It makes you precise. You stay with what holds and let the rest fall away without ceremony. You've likely seen how this affects the pace of your life. Things don't pile up the same way. You don't accumulate obligations just because they were offered. You're selective, not because you're guarded, but because you understand the cost of depth once it's engaged. Depth, for you, is not something you dip into lightly. It asks for presence, time, and consistency. You're willing to offer those, but only where they make sense. That selectivity can be misunderstood. People sometimes assume you're withholding or aloof when you're actually being careful with something you know carries weight. You don't rush to correct that impression. If clarity matters, it will arrive later in a more accurate form. You've probably noticed that you don't enjoy clutter, emotional or otherwise. Too many unresolved threads start to feel heavy. You prefer to finish things properly or let them end, rather than keep them half alive out of habit. This doesn't mean you need closure in the traditional sense. Closure, for you, is the moment when attention stops returning on its own, when the mind no longer circles back, no longer checks, no longer wonders. Once that happens, you move forward without dragging the question along behind you. You're also aware that this way of moving gives you a kind of quiet resilience. Setbacks don't derail you, they inform you. You adjust your position and continue without needing to build a story around what went wrong. That resilience isn't loud. It doesn't show up as optimism or bravado. It shows up as steadiness, as the ability to stay present when things shift and respond without losing your footing. You don't need to know how everything will turn out to feel grounded. You just need to stay attentive enough to recognize when something has shown you what it is. And so you keep moving in this way, letting attention guide your pace, allowing impulse to be tested by depth, and trusting that whatever remains after that process is worth staying with. You've probably noticed that this attentiveness also shapes how you deal with uncertainty in yourself. You don't rush to label what you're feeling or decide what it means. You let it sit, not because you're avoiding it, but because you know that early interpretations tend to flatten things that are still shifting. Feelings for you arrive more like weather than messages. You notice the pressure change before you know what to call it. Something thickens, something lightens. The name comes later, if it comes at all. What matters is how it behaves over time, not how quickly it can be explained. This is why you're often more comfortable with ambiguity than people expect. Ambiguity feels honest when it reflects something that hasn't finished forming yet. What bothers you is certainty that arrives too early, like a label placed on something that's still moving underneath. You've likely noticed that when you do finally name something, it tends to stick. The word doesn't slide around or need revising. That's because it's arrived after the process, not during it. By the time you say it, you've already lived with it long enough to know its shape. This makes your words carry weight, even when you're not trying to emphasize them. You don't speak often just to keep things moving. When you do speak, it's because there's something clear enough to put down. You also notice when other people speak too soon, when explanations rush ahead of experience, when conclusions are reached before the ground has settled. You don't always challenge this directly. Often you just step back and watch how long the explanation holds. Sometimes it holds, sometimes it collapses under its own certainty. You've learned to trust that timing matters as much as content. A true thing said too early can be just as misleading as a false one said with confidence. Waiting doesn't weaken truth. It gives it room to land properly. This patience shows up in how you handle your own mistakes as well. You don't punish yourself for them. You examine them. You look at what they reveal about your assumptions, your blind spots, the places where you moved before you were fully oriented. The lesson integrates quietly, without needing to be repeated. Because of that, you don't tend to repeat the same mistake in the same way. It changes shape the next time, or disappears altogether. Progress for you isn't linear, but it's real. You're also aware that this internal way of processing doesn't always match external expectations. People want quick answers, clear statements, visible emotion. You're operating on a different clock. You let things finish forming before you hand them over. You don't apologize for that pace anymore. You've seen what happens when you try to speed it up. Things blur. Decisions feel off. You lose the precision you rely on. So you keep trusting the slower rhythm, the one that lets attention do its work without interference, the one that doesn't force clarity before it's ready. And you continue like this, staying close to what's emerging, letting uncertainty clarify itself rather than trying to eliminate it, and allowing understanding to arrive in its own time, shaped by depth rather than urgency. Thank you for listening to the Sleepy Mind channel. I hope you have enjoyed spending time moving through the world of Scorpio.